Good morning, everyone, for those of you who are dialing in from Malaysia, and good afternoon, those of you who are coming in from Australia and elsewhere around the world. So welcome to our webinar this morning on federal-state friction amid political and pandemic plight. I'm very glad to host this from IDEAS, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs in Malaysia. And this event is being co-hosted with the ANU, Australian National University's Malaysia Institute. And very glad to welcome the director of the Malaysia Institute, Ross Tapsell, who's co-hosting this morning's webinar with me. I forgot to mention, I'm Tricia Yeo, CEO of IDEAS, also the author of the paper that we're discussing this morning. And of course, I'd like to welcome our special guest for today, YB Daryl Laking, who is the former the former Minister of International Trade and Industry and current MP of Penampang.
Sabah.
In Sabah, yes.
Hi.
Okay, all right, somebody said that I'm not speaking loud enough, so I'm going to speak a little bit louder. I hope that all of you out there can hear my voice now. So once again, good morning and thank you for joining me at the webinar. Federal-state relations is something that's close to my heart and it's something that I've been writing about and researching quite actively. I'm also doing my PhD on this subject. So I regularly keep myself updated on the ongoings on relationship between the federal and the state levels. It can be sometimes a little bit technical, but I think hopefully my presentation today will also show you why it's not just a technical matter, but it's something that's very practical and has real life consequences on people on the ground. So I will expand more of that in my presentation, but without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ross Tapsell to give his remarks, and Ross will also be kindly moderating our Q&A session today. So Ross, over to you.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you to the good people at IDEAS for helping set up and co-host this seminar. And thank you to YB Daryl Laking for participating as a discussant. I won't speak for long, I'll just give a brief introduction and then we'll move into the content. Just to let you know, the Australian National University has a long history of Malaysian studies and of Malaysia research, dating back to its founding year in 1945 to set up to help with Australia-Asia relations, and has had a number of esteemed scholars come through here and produce important works on Malaysia throughout its 70-year history and so on. So we established the ANU Malaysia Institute in 2016 to continue that tradition and to also collaborate with Malaysian partners as well as various state and federal governments. And we also have been working with the Australian government, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, on a number of research projects through their SIABO project, Southeast Asia Rules-Based Order project. And that has been published through our website on the New Mandala website. And that link is in the, was in the invitation that you received. So you can read Tricia's full report in New Mandala, which is the ANU-based website. If you want to hear more and read in more detail what Tricia will present on. So we thank Tricia for her hard work in producing this report on behalf of the ANU Malaysia Institute. Thank you for all your efforts in what is, as she said, a really important issue. And we look forward to this discussion, and it's great to be able to have such a esteemed discussant who can also talk about that from his perspective as a YB in Sabah. If you'd like to ask questions, there is a Q&A function there in Zoom that you can just click on. And you can also ask questions, as I understand it, via the IDEAS Facebook page. And there will be IDEAS staff who are monitoring those questions and filtering them all through to me. And I'll try to do my best to collate all those questions and provide a variety of questions to our speakers. So thank you again to our speakers, and look forward to hearing more and hearing from you once their presentations have concluded.
Thank you, Ross. So it's my turn now. What we're going to do is I'm just going to share some slides. I hope it won't take too long so that we have more time for interaction with those of us who are joining. And also, I think all of you are here to listen to YB Daryl. Not so much me, he's the guest star. So I'm going to share the slides with you now. Okay, everyone can see this? Good. So as mentioned earlier, the topic of today, which is based on the paper that I wrote, is federal-state friction amid political and pandemic plight. As I said earlier, federal-state relations is something that sometimes not paid much attention to at the national level because there are just so many issues that the country is tackling, and we have a lot of structural problems to address. But I believe one of them is the relationship between states and the federal government. And I'll bring you a little bit into the reason I think why that is. So before that, let's talk about what happened in Malaysia in 2020 and so far, right? So we had the week of turmoil at the end of February 2020, during which time the Prime Minister Mahathir's resignation sparked a crisis at the national political level, which ended in the King installing the current Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin as the 8th PM. I won't go into the details of what happened and what transpired to reach that end, but that happened. And the states were also affected. So in one fell swoop, while there was change at the national level, state governments also changed hands. So you had a resultant outcome where Perikatan Nasional, the new coalition that was put together, comprising Bersatu, UMNO and PAS, having 8 states plus 1 aligned state in the form of Sarawak, and 3 + 1 states in the form of Pakatan Harapan. So the Sabah Warisan, of course, is not part of Pakatan Harapan, but is a PH aligned state. So this was the result. And this underscores the point that what happens at the federal government level has a direct impact on the states, as well as what happens at below state level, so at the communities level. And then came COVID-19. So you can see that, you know, in early March, just after Muhyiddin was installed as the 8th PM, we had a rise of cases. So first, the 18 new cases, 117 in total, and then it grew within a short week, like 41 cases to over 238. And the wave of cases started just after the new PM was sworn in, right? So this chart is taken from Malaysia Kini, and you see that just after Muhyiddin was sworn in on the 1st of March, you had the big wave of cases in the red, all the way till probably about early July, which is after the RMCO stage had taken place. And then, of course, at the end of July, which we'll talk a lot more about later, you also had the Sabah Assemblyman defecting. So you can see how what happened at the beginning of the year has had a direct impact of what has taken place in Sabah. And Sabah is the first state who will be holding a state election coming up very soon on the 26th of September. But let's go back in time a little bit to understand the structure of the federal and the state relationship. And there's a lot to say, but I will just give 4 points here. So when Malaya was formed, the Federation of Malaya Agreement 1948, there was to be a strong central government, and the individuality of each of the states was to be clearly expressed. So there's a little bit of discord there. On the one hand, you have a strong central government. On the other hand, the states are also supposed to have some form of autonomy. But already at the very formation of the country in 1948, and then of course, many of these clauses were also used and adopted when the formation of Malaysia took place in 1963. Yeah, but my point here is that the clauses from the original Federation of Malaya Agreement actually got absorbed into the Independence Constitution 1957, and then of course also in 1963 formation of Malaysia. Through the years, we've had a number of incidents that actually made the federal government much stronger. So local council elections was something that we used to have in Malaysia. It started out in Kuala Lumpur and then in Penang. But the point is, it was eventually abolished. I won't go into the reasons for why they were abolished. They were abolished in 1965. So that's one other way that the federal government became more centralized and more able to control what was happening at the local level. Of course, in 1969, when there was the 13th of May racial riots, the emergency measures were placed, and then there was a National Operations Council, which also meant that the central government itself was taking matters in its own hands in terms of the development nationwide. Following from that, we had a lot of economic development policies that started from the first Malaysia Plan and the second Malaysia Plan, especially in the second Malaysia Plan, which incorporated the new economic policy. That also gave Razak at that time the impetus to roll out national level economic development policy that also was supposed to be rolled out and implemented at the state level. So again, a very strong central government. The Constitution actually has many clauses that provide for a strong federal state over federal law. I'll just give you a few examples, not everything. So for instance, Article 71, subsection 3 allows the federal government to amend a state constitution if there is non-compliance by a state with the federal constitution. Article 75 provides for the federal law to prevail when any state law is inconsistent with federal law. Article 76 allows the federal government to make laws pertaining to state matters if it promotes the uniformity of laws or if it is requested to do so by the states. And maybe one last one, Article 81 states that the executive authority of every state is to be exercised to ensure compliance with federal law and should not impede or prejudice the exercise of the federal government. So there are other articles in the Constitution, but I've just cited a couple of them to show you that the federal law, or rather the Constitution, provides for a strong federal law over state law. And then we had further centralization in the 1980s and 1990s, and that's a very young Mahathir. And that happened through a phase of privatization, where privatization took place, where many of the public utilities were privatized. And why was it considered centralization was because the decisions were largely made by the federal government, and the companies that were also given the private monopoly, as it were, over these public utilities were typically companies that were also close to the federal government in one way or other. Okay, so that's history. So now I'll talk about, and this basically takes from the paper that I wrote, and I go through different segments of the paper. So the first one is about how the political crisis impacted on the downward resource distribution. So firstly, why is resource distribution important? Constituencies largely actually depend on the members of parliament for welfare aid. That's something that we need to understand. It's a peculiarity of the Malaysian political and institutional system, in which members of parliament actually do a lot for their constituents in terms of giving aid for floods, for repairing of roofs and so on, which I'm not sure how much of this happens in other countries. So what actually happened? So you had, number one, a change of distribution in positions, where local councillors and members of village committees were immediately replaced, right, in the states that changed hands. So you could see that also in the GLCs. So states also have a lot of their own state GLCs, and the chairmanships changed in the states of Johor, Malacca, Kedah, and then of course later on Perak. Second is constituency development funds. So as I said, CDFs are very important, and the constituency development funds were claimed by the PH MPs to be removed completely, so they no longer had access to that. And I think that's important to point out that all this happened during the time of COVID as well, when people were hopefully relying more on their MPs to provide support for them as they started to lose their jobs and so on. And finally, there were also reports that the COVID-19 food basket aid was restricted. Again, these are all like the reported allegations, and there's no way for me to substantiate it unless I actually have the data from the federal government, but this was reported from the PH side. But I think I also need to point out that in a sort of tit for tat manner, and I actually said that in my paper, that the PH-run state government of Selangor also seemed to respond by denying COVID-19 related packages to their opposition aduns, their opposition state assemblymen, meaning those who were aligned with PEN, with Perikatan Nasional. So this is how the downward resource distribution was directly affected. So I just wanted to unpack a little bit more, like why do the CDFs or constituency development funds even exist? They actually are used for things that help communities, like the tarring of roads. At events, they have a lot of community events, and even like the fixing of maybe all the installation of futsal stadiums. And I would love to go more into this, but we don't have time, and hopefully my next research papers can address CDFs a bit more. Okay, so the next thing, so the pandemic itself and federal-state relations. So COVID-19 offered an important study of the legality and constitutionality of Malaysia's three-tiered system of government. We have the federal government, we have the state government, we also have the local government. So the first National Action Council meeting that was held to discuss COVID, Pakatan states were excluded from that meeting, or rather the heads of states were excluded, the Menteri Besars, the chief ministers were excluded. The only people who were invited for that were the state secretaries. And of course, at the end of it, the chief secretary of the country said that, it was his fault, it was not the fault of the prime minister. But I think this is symptomatic of the bigger problem. So the problem is that every time there's an opposition state, the civil service automatically assumes that the chief of state should not be invited to these meetings. It's a norm, it's an expected norm. It's a practice that has been happening since BN time, also PH time, by the way, and will continue during the PN time. Very interestingly, when the federal government decided to open up the economy by having a conditional movement control order, 9 of the 13 states chose not to comply with that. And more interestingly, out of the 9 states, 4 of them, I believe, were actually aligned with Perikatan Nasional. So this was very interesting to me. In the past, in the past, Barisan Nasional states were seen as an extension of the Barisan Nasional federal government. But this time, the states also felt that it was not in their interest to open up so quickly. Now, was this legal? There's disputes about what the law says. So firstly, the federal constitution actually puts public health in the concurrent list, meaning that both federal and state governments have jurisdiction over public health. However, the Prevention and Control of Infectious Disease Act 1988 is a federal law, and the federal government passed a federal order that defined infected area to include all states and federal territories in Malaysia. On the other hand, you also have the Local Government Act, which says that local governments have the ability to preserve public health, prevent outbreaks, and the spread of disease. So those who believe that the states were doing this non-compliance and those who said that this was illegal, they believed that they cited the 1988 law and said that, look, all the states are infected area, you need to comply. There's no argument about it. But there were other sets of lawyers who actually looked at Article 81 of the FC, and they said that the article actually says the states cannot impede or prejudice federal powers. And their interpretation of it was that the states, by not opening up, that act was not an act of prejudicing the federal power. In fact, it was taking a more controlled version of the movement control order. So there's a lot of legalese when you kind of try to interpret who was right and who was wrong. I think it was a point of debate, but I think in the long and short of it, the question was, could the states really enforce it on their own? And this is sort of a hypothetical question, right? Because this was never brought to court. So even if the states really did not want to open up the economy, could they actually enforce it on their own? They don't really have police enforcement powers. Police comes under the federal government. Could they do it through their local councillors? Maybe, but not quite as well. Could they do it through their local council enforcement agency officers? That's possible, but I think they just wouldn't have the reach even if they wanted to do it. Okay, next section. This section talks about what the states actually did in response to the pandemic, state autonomy. And so the states actually used their own resources, right? They came up with their own mobile apps. They had their own public communication platforms. Penang and Sarawak especially did a good job. They coordinated with charity networks to provide donations. They also emerged with their own welfare stimulus packages, and the highest of these stimulus packages came from Sabah and Sarawak, and then Selangor and Penang. So they gave out cash aid for medical frontliners, rent relief, food aid. Sabah and Sarawak issued their own immigration requirements. And also, interestingly, during a time of pandemic, the state health directors also worked well with the state EXCO members in both government and opposition states. So it's, in a sense, people were actually working towards a common cause, and this was a crisis moment and they had to cooperate. I think this is my final section. Yeah, so federal state tensions, national politics, and the pandemic response. This one looks a lot at the East Malaysia. So this is where YB Darrell will be most interested in. So as we know, Sabah and Sarawak MPs constitute more than 25% of our total 222 MPs in Parliament. This year, I think more than any other time, but also generally speaking, the parties in East Malaysia have been wooed by the Peninsula parties because of the representation at the Parliament level. So this one just talks about like what transpired, right? These are just, you know, kind of blow-by-blow events of what happened in June. So in June, Pakatan actually said that they had Pakatan Plus, but still Pakatan Plus only had 117 MPs. So that was not enough yet to really push through if they wanted to take over the federal government. And in a move that actually signaled the significance of East Malaysia to Peninsula Malaysia and generally political, national politics, Mahathir actually, you know, proposed that Shafi'i Abdal would be the prime ministerial candidate. And then, of course, there's a whole section on petroleum politics and the impact on a post-COVID economy. So I'll just spend a few minutes talking about this. So I just want to start out by saying that oil has played a huge role in the developmental model of Malaysia since the formation of the Petroleum Development Act 1974, and we have a long history of signing production sharing contracts with international oil companies. It's played a huge role in bringing up Malaysia to where it is today. KLCC, for instance, could not have been built without the revenues from Petronas. But oil-producing states like Kelantan and Terengganu, while they were under PAS as opposition at that time, they were not granted the royalties that were supposed to be given to them, right? The 5% royalties. And in recent history, Sabah and Sarawak have both demanded for royalties to be increased to 20%. Sarawak took this a step further by setting up its own oil company, Petros, and it has had this recent sales tax spat with Petronas, where under the Perikatan National Government, finally this dispute was resolved in the form of paying sales tax to Sarawak state government. And this is unprecedented. And of course, it was speculated that the board of Petronas didn't agree to it. The CEO's term was ended early. And I'll tie it back to the economy, right? So given the economic recovery needs that we have, and it's expected that even another stimulus package is needed, it will be increasingly tough for Petronas and increasingly pressured to contribute to the country's income. So currently, oil and gas resources contribute 19% to the national revenue. And there was a large dividend already given in the 2020 budget. So it'll be interesting to see what the dividend is for the 2021 budget that's coming up in November soon. And of course, finally, all this culminated in the Sabah defections and the state polls that are coming up. Okay, this is my last slide. Just basically, what are the long-term implications for federal-state relations in the country? I think we should recognize that a lot of this has to do with our electoral system as well, that we have a first-past-the-post electoral system where there's a winner takes all. And so because of that, centralization trends will likely continue. I can talk about that more during the Q&A. Is there some potential for state autonomy? So Ismail Sabri actually interestingly said that Act 342, which is the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases Act, said that it's applicable to all states except Sarawak because Sarawak has its own health ordinance. And this, in a way, is that considered a recognition that some states actually have more autonomy over the others? However, political alignment with the center still seems to be the desired outcome. So when the defections took place immediately in March, following the change at the national government level, the question really is, are they defecting because they believe in a change of principle, or are they defecting because they want to be aligned with the party that's at the federal government? Because in turn, this means that they will tend to get more resources, and they will then be seen to be more popular amongst their voters. So this is all very interesting, and I'm writing another piece about what happens, who makes the decision about the change of state governments, right, at the end of the day. And one could even argue that if you are doing it, if you are defecting because you want to be aligned with the federal government because you can get better resources to help your constituents, could that be argued as a good, even positive move so that you're helping your constituents? I mean, I'm just being a devil's advocate and kind of like asking the questions and pushing the boundaries a little bit. My conclusion is that political uncertainty at the national level will continue to have a direct impact on states and local levels. This will continue to be played out, I think, over the next year even. So with that, I know more questions than answers, but I'd like to thank you for your time, for your attention, and I will end the slide presentation now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good one.
All right, over to you, Ross.
Okay, thank you very much, Tricia. Very comprehensive presentation in such a short period of time. I also just say again, for those who are looking for more comprehensive details from her presentation, you can read the full report. It's publicly available, it's free to download, and it's on the ANU's new Mandala site, which was linked into the email invitation that you received. If you didn't receive it, we can also put it in the chat group. Anyway, thank you very much, Tricia. And now over to YB, Daryl Laking, for his discussion comments.
Hi, thank you, and Kopi Vosian. That's greetings in Kadazan. Great to see you, Ross, and of course, Tricia. It's been a while. I hope both of you all are doing well as all our participants in this particular Zoom webinar. Now, you touched a couple of things, and there's so many subjects that I like to touch, but I'll go specific to only a few if you don't mind. Tricia, you mentioned about state and federal friction. Okay, this has been a big problem for Sabah all this while, as well as Sarawak. But as you can see, there has been a wave of what do you call that? Awakening from Sabahans, more so after the May 2018 elections, where we were able to first form the state government in Sabah, and we were able to also contribute participation at the federal level through 3 ministers plus 2 deputy ministers coming from Warisan alone. Yeah. In your presentation, of course, you did put into mark Pakatan Harapan as running the state in Sabah, but I'd like to make some correction. And I mean no insult or any demeanor in this, other than to put the facts right. It is a warisan-led government where, as you correctly pointed out, we are not part of the coalition, but we are a plus of that coalition. And there may be also disagreements within us and Pakatan Harapan, and yet we resolve it within ourselves. I'd like to touch also, I don't like to jump into here and there, but you mentioned Mahathir proposed Shafee to become the prime ministerial designate candidate. That is not really a fact. He did mention it, but subsequently DAP and Amanah admitted that it was their idea, and they had subsequently issued their caveats over that idea. They did say that Anwar be given the chance first, and failing which Shafee should be the alternate choice. Now in Sabah, we mentioned about the state and federal friction. It has been a sore point for us. And when we took over the government, one of the first acts that Datu Shafee, the Chief Minister, wanted us to do in the federal cabinet was to ensure that industrialization would be brought back to Sabah. And that is one of the duties that I had as a Malaysian minister. I cannot deny that I'm from Sabah. And of course, what I saw, Ross, I don't know whether you're aware of this, and Tricia, and to all our participants, Sabah's gas asset were being sent to Bintulu, to Sarawak, our neighbor. We were giving the whole of our gas to Bintulu. And since 2013, when the first gas flowed into Bintulu, Bintulu had achieved tremendous success, economic success. And that is why you can see Sarawak is well fueled with money. They've got huge reserves. And Sabah does not have, in fact, until today, what Sarawak have. So this is what we've always suspected. The federal government, because of their centralization, have managed to outmaneuver Sabah and send its wealth to our neighbor Sarawak, thereby making Sarawak very strong. But that's another point of discussion on another day. But what I wanted to point out is, coming from having been given the chance to serve in MITI, I saw how much investment approval was given to Sarawak from 2013 to 2018. If you total it up, it'll sum up to more than 40 billion. Per year, it'll be like 8 billion, 16 billion for Sarawak. Whereas in Sabah, the highest at any one time during that 2013 to 2018 period, the highest one-year investment approval was only 3 billion. Totaling 2013 to 2018, less than 10 billion for Sabah. So you can see how state and federal friction had caused Sabah to lose out so much. And what we did, and of course someone will surely ask, what we did during our time, from 2018 July right up to February 2020, we managed to discuss with MIDA, we managed to discuss with a lot of investors to shift the investment to Sabah. And I'm glad to say that we've managed to approve incentives to several companies who have agreed to invest a total of close to 18 billion throughout the 18 months that we served as a minister to Sabah. We try to catch up what we've lost. Now we go back into another subject which you asked on the Federation of Malaysia Agreement 1948. In fact, we should do that. We should do away with that. My position has always been, there was never, and I'm sure you know, Ross, you guys in Australia would have done your research. I was in your university to attend a seminar, and I've said the same thing again. And I reiterate our stand, even to Mahathir and even to all my cabinet colleagues when we were serving the cabinet, that there is no Malaysia, if not for Sabah and Sarawak and the West Malaysia states, agreeing to form in 1963, the 16th of September 1963. And in fact, any talk of any agreement before that probably may have been a mistake even by the draftsman. Because if you look at the current federal constitution, Article 160 on the definition describes Malaysia wrongly to me. And that is my legal opinion. And I've raised this a couple of times in the cabinet. And of course, it takes a while for our West Malaysian friends to understand as well. Article 160 defines the Federation of Malaysia as in the same definition of the 1957 Federation of Malaysia agreement, which does not make sense because there was no the Malaya Agreement 1957. There was no Malaysia until 1963. So that's another point of contention that I think Malaysians as a whole should look into as to why is the Article 160 definition on the Federation of Malaysia refers to the Federation of Malaya 1957. All those things you mentioned as well, a lot of the articles of the previous Malaya Constitution were subsequently adopted into the 1963 Federation of Malaysia Constitution, or the Federal Constitution, which became the basis of the Federation of Malaysia. So legal minds as well as academicians should really look into it and resolve it. We tried our best within our time, and Datu V.K. Liew, my colleague, who was the minister in charge of law, pushed the Prime Minister and pushed the cabinet, and we did subsequently form the Malaysian Agreement 1963 committee, which comprised of the Prime Minister, the Chief Ministers of Sabah and Sarawak, as well as selected cabinet members during that time. And with all the challenges we faced, we were able to resolve 17 issues out of the 21 issues that we saw were in contradiction with state and federal, more so when the Malaysian Agreement 1963 had specifically given Sabah and Sarawak its own domain, its own power. But unfortunately, through the effluxion of time, so many things happened, so many changes had happened that we lost. And how do you say that? All these powers that Sabah and Sarawak had were eroded to the federal government and centralized. So the gist of one of the subjects that you raised were there was too much centralization. And this is what many Sabahans, and I hope the future will continue to demand this, that we decentralize a lot of powers and administration into Sabah. The devolution of powers, which were done under the discussions that we had throughout our period, where 17 powers or rights, in this case, were returned back to Sabah, thereby leaving only 4 contentious issues which were not resolved throughout our time. But I hope that the current government will not stop and they will continue to resolve these outstanding issues, and where they can add more. Can you imagine Sabah had lost its right at one time to handle 200 nautical miles from its shore? That became federal control. I think this is something that we've always found to be not right, because it would give the federal government so much power to control even our marine life. Deep sea fishing was one of the, the licensing of the deep sea fishing were also one of the resolution that we managed to solve during the Malaysia Agreement Committee that was formed. So, Ross, can you imagine you coming from Canberra, the state, the federal government controls your minerals? It's just not right. But in Sabah, that was the case. We have our own Sabah Land Ordinance, we have our own mineral rights, but unfortunately, through decentralization, a lot of our powers were subsequently evolved up to the federal government, thereby we lost that control in Sabah. But we're in progress, and I think that given the chance, this coming election, if we are elected once again to form the federal government, the state government, and eventually the federal government. First the state, let's break the wall slowly. We form the state government. I can see the Chief Minister of Sabah, Dato Sri Shafi Muhammad Abdal, has a deep passion for Sabah, a deep passion for the Borneo state. But he's one person that I've learned. He is someone who does not confront. He negotiates and discusses and gets what he wants. As you can see, 17 out of 21 issues, as I mentioned, were resolved through non-confrontational discussion. And he's always been someone, the Chief Minister of Sabah has always been someone who believes that we will work on a government-to-government basis, regardless who's the federal government. When we were removed as ministers in February 24th, 2020, we've made it very clear to even the incoming Prime Minister, as much as we disagreed with how they formed the backdoor government, we said that we will maintain our government-to-government working relationship with them. Now, the problem is, I relate to what you mentioned, constituency development funds and what have you. We lost our constituency development fund as members of parliament because we were in the opposition. But they maintain, the current federal government maintain what the Pakatan Harapan government maintained as well, the 100,000 allocation for every opposition member of parliament. Now, I'm not saying that it's not right, nor am I saying it's right, because Pakatan as well made the same error. I call it an error now because I've soon realized that we should have pushed that all fair allocation should be given, and even if where they feel that the assemblyman or the members of parliament cannot be holding that funds for whatever reasons they have, we should be giving it to the district office. We should be giving the same fundings to the appropriate people, the civil servants who run the local authorities. In that way, you will not deprive people of the allocation that can help their constituency. You know, the problem people have is they don't want to give it to the opposition member. Fine, maybe if that is an issue, Pakatan made probably the same error, but they did give 100,000 and then subsequently followed by this government. They should, in fact, give the full constituency allocation to the district office. After all, the district office are civil servants who have good administrative standards, and they should be running and utilizing these funds for the people of that constituency. Now,
YB, that's a really good point. I was thinking of asking that when it came to question time, actually, and obviously there's going to be a lot of questions on the Sabah election.
Okay.
And so can you just give us a brief rundown around access to resources and allocation to resources as you see it heading into that election? Are you can you give us an overview of how you think that landscape is currently playing out and will continue to play out in terms of access of and resources and allocation of resources leading up to September 26th?
Before that, Ross, thank you for that. Can I just touch on something that Trisha touched on? Act 342. Now, the minister, Ismail Sabri, may have missed out. Again, like I said, it could be advice from his people around him. He probably forgot that Sabah has its own Public Health Ordinance 1960. And we have what Sarawak have, we have the same. So if he were to say that Sarawak is exempted, he probably forgot to say Sabah is too. So, and we are very much in control of our public health services because we have our own Ministry of Health where we help out the federal government to implement whatever health policies that they have. And that is Sabah, just like Sarawak. There's this funny thing that they always think Sarawak is more independent than Sabah in that sense, or sovereign than Sabah, more sovereign than Sabah, because they've always, his party before UMNO, now he's Bersatu, Ismail Sabri's party before was in total control of Sabah, which we proudly broke down. And we hope more Sabahans, more West Malaysians will pray that we make sure that they don't form the state government ever again. Anyway, going back to the elections, now I touch on Ross's question. You know, Ross, we've always had this problem in Sabah. Allocation or development allocation to Sabah as a state, right, have always been based on who we are aligned with at the federal government. Constitutionally, they must give us our development fund. That is beyond doubt. But what they did recently is a mirror of what they did during Tan Sri Joseph Pairing Kitingan's time as Parti Bersatu Chief Minister in Sabah between the period of 1985 to 1994. They created agencies, federal agencies, to manage this development rights or development funds that Sabah constitutionally deserved. They did not allow the state government to monitor, to manage the allocations and development funds that are entitled to Sabah constitutionally and also morally. Why I say morally? You have so much federal funds collected, taxes and what have you. And when it's tabulated to be given to each state, they want to manage it instead of the state government. And I think that is wrong. Why? Is because a huge portion of this money comes from the taxes paid as well, not only by other states, but also Sabah. I relate this to Petronas. Sabah keeps on asking for its 20% and what have you. And Shafi has already explained that even Mahathir has offered Sabah 20% share of Petronas, but this didn't go through because of the change of government. Another topic for discussion on another date. But really, when the Perikatan government was formed, they started proposing to create another agency that manages that allocation that Sabah rightfully deserves. I don't think that's right, because the laws pertaining to Sabah state licenses, the laws pertaining to our lands, and all other that has effect when it comes to development grants and what have you, are still run by the state government, regardless who they are, whether they are with the central or otherwise. So Sabahans don't deserve to be treated this way. But each one on their own, for some reason, the justification will be you should be aligned with the federal government. That is wrong. And Australia is one example. A lot of your states were never aligned with your federal government anyway.
Yeah, it's been an interesting time. COVID has brought out a lot of issues around federal-state relations in Australia too. So there's some really interesting debates going on here. Some of which, yeah, Tricia touched on. I might move to some of these questions for the both of you that people are sending through, and for those listening at home, you can add your question into the Q&A chat group there on Zoom, and we're also taking questions via the Ideas Facebook page, and Ideas staff are sending me, collating questions and sending me.
Can I just mention there's a question? Why do you think Sarawak is less?
Yeah, I'll get to it, YB. Yeah, I promise to get to all the questions that Ideas sends me. So the first question that they've sent me, Tricia, is to you about what's to stop states from conducting plebiscite independent from the Electoral Commission and then doing the local council appointments on that basis.
Yeah, so I think this was actually raised when Pakatan Rakyat took over Selangor and Penang in 2008. And this was brought to the attention of the National Council on Local Government, which somebody has raised actually. So yes, the NCLG exists, but it's actually, it could be argued as an infringement of state rights because local government comes under the state list of the Federal Constitution. But that's a different point. But back to local elections, I believe that the Election Act actually states that only the Election Commission is permitted to run elections throughout the country. At least that was the reason that was given when both Selangor and Penang wanted to raise this at the NCLG. In fact, the Penang state government brought the whole case to court, and they were defeated because the court's judgment said that the matter has to be brought to the NCLG. The NCLG has to approve that point of the agenda, and then will have to therefore forward it to the Election Commission to act. And there's another law which I'm not so certain, I haven't followed so closely, but the point is that the NCLG is ultimately still chaired by the Prime Minister. However, given all the legal restrictions, I also agree that actually states, if they wanted to push it, if they wanted to do it, they can. I mean, they could do like a simple community voting at the zone level, you know, to select councillors in charge of each zone to make up the full set of the local council appointments. So I don't believe that just simply saying that the acts say this and that, that should stop the states completely. But then the states must be willing to do something. And I guess one possibility is that they would be brought to court by the federal government on that count.
Great. There was a second question, perhaps to both of you, asking, would a more powerful, independent and reformed Senate be a positive force in balancing federal-state relations? Tricia, would you like to go first and then over to YB?
Okay, sure. So the Senate is another point that I've written about, which is that the Senate was supposed to be the House of the states. So Senate is supposed to represent states' interests, right, throughout the country. But the formation of the Senate and the ratio of state-appointed versus centrally appointed senators has reduced greatly over the years. And so today you have like a great majority of centrally appointed to state appointed, and this ratio should be reversed. It should be restored to its original ratio. And in fact, if you want to push the reforms even further, one could even argue that could there also be elections for the senators, which currently doesn't take place. It's all by appointment basis.
Okay, on the Senate, they serve a maximum of 2 terms, which is only 6 years, 3 years each. And it must be only for those above 30. And supposedly the idea were people who are underrepresented. That is why in the states of Sabah, we have 2 state legislative proposed senators. And the other senators are appointed directly by the Agong. And I think, yeah, you're right. Maybe we may need to reform on how we can, have better representation at the Senate. Maybe an election of the senators are necessary. Yeah, it can be considered. But again, it's a federal matter, unfortunately.
So there's a lot of questions around oil and gas, and I'll get to one of them in a second. But I guess just YB, just to ask you, when I was in Sarawak recently, and when people talked about oil and gas issues and federal-state relations, they often brought it down to sort of really basic needs around petrol prices or GST and issues like that, rather than sort of broader issues around state autonomy. What about in your constituency, and how is that playing out currently in as we head towards an election campaign? How do you perceive what people in your constituency are saying now about the oil revenues and petrol prices, GST? Is it really local, basic economic needs discussion, or is there a broader argument around greater state autonomy?
Before I answer that, there's a question that I'd like to touch on. Maybe the participant wrongly heard. What I meant was Sarawak is more confrontational than Sabah. Sabah approaches things in a negotiated way, and that's why we did what we did during our time in the government. And that's why we maintain G2G with the federal government, albeit we're not with the central government. So Sarawak has been very confrontational in their demands, and I think sometimes we may have to consider that mode as well. When if we remain friendly and we negotiate the way we are, we may not get what we want, because we tend to be bullied if we don't show our position as strong as our Sarawakian friends. Now that's corrected. I would be more confrontational with the federal government today, but asking them to respect what is our rights within the federal constitution as well as the Malaysia Agreement 1963. Now touching on the petrol prices. Petrol prices, right, you mentioned, or the rights over our oil and gas. Our major contention by all Malaysians, more so Bonians, are our rights over our oil. We should be able to manage it. If Petros was created by the Sarawakians, Sabah has the same. It is called the Sabah Petroleum as well as the Sabah Oil and Gas Development Corporation, which is all leading towards what the Sarawakians are doing. The only difference is the federal government most of Petronas have always given the Sarawakians a little bit more than us. They have, like I said, all our gas goes to Bintulu, and because of because of that gas, industry was built in Bintulu, whereas Sabah just remains as a gas supplier of sort. So when you don't utilize, or when you can't monetize your gas, and other state monetize your gas, obviously you lose out. So my constituents, not only my constituents, but Sabahans who understand this will always demand us to demand for a revisit of the Petroleum Development Act 1974. And that is why Shafi believed that negotiating it through the MA63 committee would have resolved this. And those are the 4 remaining issues that have not been resolved. Out of 21 issues in the MA63, 4 remains unsolved, 17 were resolved. And of the 4 would be our management of our assets on gas and also petroleum. Now, I believe political parties will use this issue, more so our opponents. But ultimately, Petronas, Sabah have to revisit, as well as Sarawak, the Petroleum Development Act 1974, and see how we can best manage our oil and gas in Sabah. There are a lot of new finds, a lot of new sites which have been found recently, and I believe Petronas have yet to also open up a lot of the sites that have gas and also oil in Sabah. And this is something Sabah should participate, just as Petros have participated on.
YB, sorry Ross, can I just jump in? Since you're talking about oil and gas, I think that it's true that the optics from the peninsular side is very much that Sarawak is more aggressive in its approach to fighting for its oil rights than Sabah. In fact, you hardly see like news about Sabah calling for its rights over here. But I just wanted to ask you, because I think anyone who understands like the way the production sharing contracts, I think now they're actually called PACs rather than PSCs, right. How they work. I mean, calling for 20% royalty actually doesn't really make economic sense, right? But it's sort of become something that every politician has to say. But in reality, if you really put in a 20% royalty, then it doesn't make economic sense, because the international oil companies will not actually be attracted to come in. Yeah, so I know it might be difficult for you to answer, but it's just...
It's like this. No, it's not that difficult. The 20% has always been, a platform by many politicians. In our case, Dato' Shafi and the then Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, had somehow reached some sort of an agreement where a reflection of that 20% shareholding becomes a share in Petronas. Okay, so we have yet to really work into that. Now, the 20% itself, there's a lot of ways to resolve it as well. I would look into giving Sabah more rights over its management of the oil and gas. You mentioned about the PAC, production sharing contracts. Now you have the production risk contracts as well, where they share the risk. And I think Sabah is ready for this as well, because we have so many oil and gas companies that are demanding for jobs, that are craving and hoping to be given a share of whatever Petronas is doing over our oil and gas. Now, less aggressive, yes, I admit, maybe it's time for us to be more aggressive, but we need the mandate now to be more aggressive, because we can see this current federal government, as Ross also pointed out, will be using those resources and allocation to deny Sabah what it deserves. So we need to be more aggressive, but without this mandate, a strong mandate from the people of Sabah, this federal government will probably bully us and not listen to us. Sarawak can afford to do that because they've got 30 over billion reserves. And we've only got 3 or 4, I'm not too certain, but 3 or 4 billion reserve. And it is always about who has the bigger purse. Now, Sarawak has a couple of billion, 30 billion reserve. They can do a lot of things without the federal government.
I might finish, I guess, with a broader question around federal-state relations under COVID. And it's a relatively long one, so I'll read the whole thing because it does provide some context. And the question is this: extremely centralized federations with dominant government-linked companies like Malaysia rightly attract criticism in normal times for governance failings and inefficiencies. This crisis doesn't diminish that decentralization argument, but centralized systems tend to be better organized and united for pandemic responses. The counterfactual is Australia's fragmented response and states effectively becoming countries with border policies. Like I said, that's a very big issue at the moment. You know, federal saying, well, it's up to the states closing borders, federal government wanting to open borders. But anyway, the question is there a middle ground or legal/political safeguards that you consider might resolve such conflicts? Tricia, maybe you to begin.
Well, actually, in my article, I actually looked at, well, I cited Kerala in India as an example of how they actually successfully managed their COVID cases precisely because healthcare there had been quite decentralized already for a number of years. And in a way, Kerala was a good, or it has been cited at least as a good success case study for other federations because of their centralization, they were able to collaborate more quickly with private clinics, with local hospitals and doctors and so on. I mean, I'm not sure, maybe the call for decentralization needs to also be attached to a more nuanced condition. So it's not just about decentralization, but maybe it's also about the quality of decentralization. So I can imagine that in a country like Malaysia, the question of decentralization has to be, and it has to be coupled with the question of capacity, right? So you can imagine that some of the richer states like Selangor, Johor, Penang, probably Sabah and Sarawak would have the capacity because they've had state autonomy, a little bit more state autonomy than the peninsular states over the years, might be able to do that. But the smaller states like Perlis, Kedah, to a certain extent, Kelantan, well, maybe not because they've also had some, you know, they've worked independently for a long time as well. Maybe that there needs to be some nuance there. So you have different tiers of capacity. Maybe the smaller states with less capacity, with less resources can be pulled together so that they can share resources. Yeah, so I think we need to unpack like what decentralization and devolution also means in terms of actual handling of pandemic. And maybe, you know, crisis moments need to be treated in a separate way from normal conditions. And under normal conditions, I could imagine that primary healthcare could be decentralized. So states actually can have management over what we have called the klinik kesehatan, so community clinics. I don't see why Putrajaya needs to control the financing of community clinics, for instance, and the management of the staffing there. So I think two things, one is capacity and the other thing is like crisis versus normal times.
I agree with Tricia on this, and I'll dwell on it a little bit more, but can I just relate to something in regards to centralization? You see, when we agreed to form the Federation of Malaysia, among others were the federal government were to manage our health, to manage our education, as well as our sovereignty. Today, we saw how the Philippines government, for their own reason, I'm not very certain why, is demanding that Sabah is still part of their state. And they even annexed Sabah in their map into their passport, which is totally crazy because Sabah is sovereign, and this has been settled a long time ago. But the federal government, as you can see, Mr. Hishamuddin, the foreign minister, only tweeted he should be demanding and summon the Filipino ambassador to his to Wisma Putra and give him a dressing down. But unfortunately, while we have entrusted security as well as our protection over to the federal government, that centralized federal government plays along with their sentiments because we are not in line with them, state and federal. I'm assuming that's, I don't have proof of it, but I think it's in the pudding when they are not acting and whacking the Filipino government for trying to annex Sabah, whilst we have agreed to give security as well as protection totally in the hands of the federal government. So decentralization may be needed now, not that we can resolve this because army, police, and defense is not under our hands, but we can better demand, probably since the terrain is more known to us in Sabah. So the same light applies as Tricia mentioned. Help because we know how to rate. Help because we know our conditions and we have powers at the state that controls land as well as licensing that relates ultimately to health facilities as well as health services. Now, you can see Sabah was the first state to block foreign entry by the Chinese well before the fall of the Pakatan government. I remember in the cabinet, some of my colleagues were questioning why Shafi Abdal stopped the entry of many of these tourists coming into Sabah. We were criticized by both sides, but he did. And that is why the cases of the confirmed cases in Sabah on COVID was only 417, resulting unfortunately with 8 deaths and 397 recovery. Whereas just next door to us, like Sarawak, they had about 600 over cases. So if you talk about, and they had 19 deaths. So when you talk about who managed it well, it's very subjective. We would like to think Sabah managed it well because when and before COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, before the fall of the Pakatan government, Sabah Warisan plus Pakatan stopped the entry of foreign nationals into Sabah. So they were saying our industry was going to die. But Shafi prioritized people's first, the Sabahans and Malaysians first, before any other economy at that time. Yeah.
Thank you. We have gone slightly over schedule, so apologies for that. I hope all of you have enjoyed the presentation. Certainly, I think it's been a wonderful discussion, and I'd like to thank once again on behalf of the ANU Malaysia Institute. Thank you to YB Darryl Liking and also to Tricia Yeo, the head of ideas, for writing the report. And once again, feel free to read the entire report at the new Mandala website under Malaysia. Tricia, over to you for any final comments or remarks and to close.
Okay, well, thank you once again, Ross. Thank you to YB Darryl for spending your time. I know you're very busy now given the state elections coming up soon. I think I just want to end by saying that this is it's an ongoing discussion that we at Ideas are having, and we would like to continue as well. I do myself feel that I will continue to write about this topic. I'm sorry that we were not able to answer all the questions. But please, you know, this will be recorded. It'll be put on our Facebook pages. And finally, if you're interested in any of our ideas work, we do a lot of other research and we produce a lot of publications in the areas of democracy and governance, economics and business, social policy, fiscal policy, and all of that is on our various social media platforms and on our website as well. We want to promote better evidence-based policy making in Malaysia, and we hope to be able to influence as many policymakers as we can. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll sign off now. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Tricia. Can I just mention, Tricia, can you look into a divide in Sabah which we tried to patch up? The East Coast and West Coast of Sabah, where the former regime divided us by political parties, Muslims and non-Muslims, or East Coast and West Coast. So everybody made this mistake, but maybe Ideas can look into how we can begin to unify the people of Sabah first in order to work closely with our Sarawakian and West Malaysian partners. The divide between Sabah is East Coast and West Coast, where some distrusts are there. I don't know if you've been to the East Coast of Sabah, but I know you've been to Kota Kinabalu. That I know. But I'm not sure if you've gone. And they have wonderful and beautiful people there. Maybe, Ross, you should drop by to Sabah once the COVID pandemic are over and look into the great divide of two beautiful communities from the East Coast and West Coast, which are the same people, save for politics were divided. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I wish we could discuss more longer and on topics, and I'd love to participate again, and do wish us luck. We really need this mandate to make things right in Sabah. Thank you.
Best of luck. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll have to do more research and investigation into the issues of Sabah and Sarawak. I think that's something we can think about in the long term.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you once again, and thanks everyone who participated. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.